let me ask you a question. Okay. Has anybody in this room never heard either Dan or myself?
Yes, that's great.
So refreshing, isn't
it? Yeah, that is good. So we're going to ask you to come up here and do this event with us. So we are going to be speaking about the future of psychotherapy by first doing one segment of our joint presentation on the past of psychotherapy, then moving into the present, and then diving into the future in the sense of where things maybe should go, where they could go, and maybe where they're sort of aiming to go, which aren't always the same things. So,
and of course we're both very honored that Rich Simon thought that we could look into the future and that we could predict where we're going to be, and I couldn't think of better people to predict the future, because we've always been wrong up to now.
Yeah.
So let's start with the arc, because there's been an arc, and an arc with many byways. And so for me it's curious to see where the arc is going, and I'm sure that Dan and I will have slightly different pathways that we both see in the past and see in the present. I think the first part of the arc is the fact that PTSD became a diagnosis. And so that made something legitimate, identifiable, studyable. It's a very big deal. Most of you probably weren't born when that happened, but it was like everything else in this world, it's a political issue. We created the diagnosis of PTSD. What had happened up to then is that those of us who were working at the VA saw a lot of guys who were out of control. The chief complaint used to be, I have become a monster. Nobody is safe with me. That was very consistent. And now we had to convince the VA that these guys had become a monster because of the war. And so we had to make a diagnosis that somehow linked their monsterhood to the war situation. And so we created a diagnosis called PTSD that starts with some horrendous event has happened to you, and that causes you to have flashbacks and nightmares. Flashbacks and nightmares came the organizing function because we had to organize it according to a memory of something bad that has happened. A purely political decision. Because the chief complaint was not, I have terrible memories about what happened. The chief complaint was, I cannot love my family and my kids, and I'm out of control. And so politics keeps interfering, and when we talk about the prediction of the future, we will probably talk about the political realities also versus the clinical or scientific realities, most of which tend to be sort of divergent of each other. Right? And so, but the creation of a diagnosis was a very big deal, and one of the great regrets I have is of the thousands of hours I've spent on getting another diagnosis in, namely developmental trauma disorder or complex trauma, because it became very clear that having been abused or neglected by your own caregivers is a completely different constellation of neurobiological and mental events than having been exposed to some horrendous event as an adult for the first time. We have consistently failed at that, despite numerous scientific articles, numerous prospective studies. And so the way I like to think about our field is that we are homeless people. There is no diagnosis in DSM that comes anywhere close to what we see in our clinical practice. As long as we don't have a home, as long as we are homeless, it becomes very difficult to systematically study and know what to do. So we are relegated by politics to be like a little African village where we talk about our experiences, but we have very little concrete science about the actual patients who we treat. So that's a very big deal. But things happened along the way. And what's also interesting is that the things that happened along the way, by and large, were things that were not welcomed. One of the first things that really became obvious is the issue of dissociation. And I'm very pleased that my friend Frank Putnam, who was one of the earlier pioneers in that, just wrote a book called The Way We Are. about the history of dissociation, which then we quickly discovered these were things that had already been talked about for well over 100 years, but we also discovered very rapidly that anybody who studied this stuff before too long were put into the black hole of oblivion. There is something about studying multiple cells and multiple organizations of cells that is very bad for your career. Frank Putnam, who is, to my mind, one of the heroes of my generation, in his last, after doing a prospective study that is still going on of 35 years of following up incest victims from age 7 to now into their late 30s, in the last year of his stay at the National Institute of Health, was no longer allowed to do his own research. He was only allowed to do physical examinations for the research of people who were doing real science. And so this stuff is not good for your career. And so the future is also going to be like this, a little bit like the affordable healthcare bill. It's like there's some very strong voices against people getting good care, the reality of people's lives getting noticed, the reality of child abuse being acknowledged, the reality of society actually going after. We know now what the effect of child abuse is, and we have done a lot of good studies by that, but we continue to ignore these things on the political level. Dan, who is from Southern California and therefore a much less crusty person than I am, tends to talk about these things in a much gentler and open form. I'm a New Englander. I know about hard winters with a Dutch accent. And I also get confronted regularly with the reality of the disparity between what we know and what we actually see and what gets implemented. So for the future, it continues to be primarily a political issue of trying to help people to face reality. And that has been extraordinarily difficult in the last 30 years. It's always hard. So what came in, to my mind? Neuroscience came in, and we started to take pictures of people's brains, and we got to see some of the biological correlates of what we see in our offices. Very helpful, because it allowed us to take some of the things we see in our offices, which tend to be very confusing, seriously, and say, oh, this person has shut down her feelings about her body. She no longer can feel her body. That person seems to have gotten stuck in always being afraid because that part of their brain is lighting up all the time. This person is unable to filter out what's relevant and irrelevant because in the other part of the brain, the filtering part of the brain is shut down. And so that, for me, has always been the driving force behind my research is, okay, if we know what goes wrong, what would be the right intervention there? That has not been supported by the National Institute of Health, by the way. So neuroimaging, neuroscience, seeing some of the correlates. Next thing, from my mind, EMDR. Very powerful change agents. We got to see how in a very few sessions, sometimes one, we could lay traumatic memories to rest. Major thing, to my mind. It also got me out of thinking that language, talking, and the relationship are the only things by which people get better. Sometimes you can do things with people who don't like you, and they still can get better. Amazing things. Dan heard that I said that the relationship is not important. That's totally not true. The relationship is everything because we're relational creatures. Our brains are relational things. That's what we have brains for. So relationship is everything. But the relationship doesn't cure. We can talk about it. Relationship, of course, is a sine qua non. You don't need to tell me about relationship because the therapeutic alliance, of course, is the foundation of people getting better.
So can I? Yeah. Just so you know, what Bessel and I talked about beforehand was that we would each do what our dear friend John O'Donohue would have called a blast. So Bessel is doing his blast now. So some of you are looking like, why isn't Dan also talking? Well, we've decided we're going to give each other space, and then it's going to be more interactive. So this is an intentional blasting of you from Bessel's heart to you.
I don't know if people are thinking that. How many people are thinking, why isn't Dan talking? 2 people. Because anybody who knows me, that I make room for other people immediately. So that's always the trouble with attributing things to other people. Okay. Anyway.
Thank you. No, that's okay. No. You know, because I'll give go back a little bit more, but go on with EMDR. I don't want to interrupt. No, please. I'll do it.
Okay, so EMDR was a very big thing. And what EMDR also showed to me is that things that we traditionally think gets people better may not be the only ingredients. So wiggling your fingers in front of people's eyes makes something happen. That is interesting. So you can do things to the organism that shifts things inside. And so what's become very focal for me since the time is to find a shift organism, to get people out of where they are into a new state. And I could talk about many ways I've done that, but I don't think it's what this is about. And so EMDR is a big thing. Next thing...
Can you all hear well?
No.
So I would just speak like an echo, so speak slowly.
So another very big thing is learning about the body. For me, meeting Peter Levine and Pat Ogden really fit in with the neuroscience research that we're doing. Namely, what we found is that the areas of the brain that have to do with your body aren't working very well. And then Peter Levine and Pat Ogden, people like that, came around and taught us about the body. And what became very clear very quickly is that trauma is held in people's sensations. It's not held as stories, they're held inside of people. So working with the body became terribly important. Third thing, parallel to our field, we had the attachment field. And people like Atronic and Beatrice Bibi and Dante Cicchetti now in Minnesota, Atronic were looking at interactions between mother and Mary Main, of course. We're looking at early interactions. And what slowly emerged is something that still hasn't really made it into even the mainstream of the networker, is when we look at what causes people's continuing to live in misery is not so much trauma. It's not events. It is disorganized attachment. It's about not having been seen, not having been known as a kid. And we keep talking about let's eradicate that trauma. But the real issue is how do we help people to get a sense of self and a firm sense of self and self-love if you grew up being ignored and not being seen. And the other thing that came out of the attachment literature is that the way you cope with not being seen and not being known and not being comforted is by shutting yourself down, by dissociation. And so this whole issue of dissociation is gigantic, and it keeps sort of being pushed aside. At one point, I helped to start the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, a gigantic organization of 150 sites in all 50 states of the country, funded by Congress. And now we look at all these kids. We're not studying dissociation because it's just not popular. It's just not what people like to go. So that is another big piece. The other piece, again, part of that is, to my mind, IFS. The stuff that Dick Schwartz teaches us is that people cope with trauma by coping mechanisms. And some of these coping mechanisms is to become as tough so that nobody can get to you, or that you start cutting yourself, or you start drinking, you start doing something. And that doesn't mean that all of you is doing that. A part of you now is in charge of protecting a core self. And for me, that is an extremely helpful therapeutic model, to think that what you see is not necessarily what you get, and that we present parts of ourselves to the outside world. But when you meet a person who is aggressive, doesn't mean that all of this person is aggressive. There's somewhere inside there's probably a very scared or a very worried or a very self-hating part of themselves, and accessing all these parts becomes terribly important. For me, the last piece is that we have learned so much about how the brain really gets very damaged by early childhood trauma, particularly, and later on also. And the first inkling that I have had is that we can actually rewire some of that damage is by doing neurofeedback. And so for me, the frontier, not for other people, is neurofeedback and having people play computer games with their own brains so they can actually rewire some of these disturbed patterns of engagement that we can visualize in the brain.
Thank you, Bessel. So what Bessel and I are doing at this moment is reviewing the past, kind of where we've come. So I want to rewind it a little bit further back. And you wrote that incredible article, about Pierre Genet years ago that I think was a really groundbreaking article, really thinking about who our ancestors were in terms of therapists. But even going further back, I just want to say that in communities, there were people who took care of other people. In the old days, there used to be religious, spiritual, wise people in the village, right? And so as we've come to a more secular world, a modern culture, we have this thing where people are yearning for something, but you've had religious figures and religious institutions be separated from the needs someone might have for their internal sense of meaning and emotion. So just to give a broad swath on that, it became an issue that we stopped living in community. And this lack of belonging is a huge aspect that's usually unspoken about what we're about in psychotherapy. So that's the first thing in terms of our past. The second thing, getting more immediate, is that in our field of mental health, and we have so many different disciplines we can just see in the room, how many of you are from the field of psychology? Raise your hand, really high, so we can see. How many from the field of social work? And master's level therapists? Great. And educational therapists? Occupational therapists? Dance therapists? Okay. Movement therapists of other sorts? Art therapists? Okay, great. Well, I said marriage and family therapy, master's level. Yeah. And then how about psychiatrists? Okay, a handful of us. All right, great. So we have this broad field called mental health, which includes all of us. Are there psychiatric nurses in the room? Great. And any other groups I didn't mention? And body therapists? And pastoral counseling, thank you. Any other psychodrama, okay? And yoga therapists, mindfulness therapists? Great. So, we have this big field, let's just call it the field of mental health, which has many disciplines. And the first thing to say about our field from a historical point of view is we've had no definition of the mental, of being a mental health professional. There is no definition of the mind, which is just bizarre. And we could try it in this room just to see, but besides lectures I've given you, how many of you in your formal training in your particular discipline were told what the mind is? Please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, out of, I don't know, how many hundred do we have in the room? Does anyone know? 400. So 3 out of 400 is less than 1%. And you are devoted learners. So I've done this around the planet to 100,000 people, then I stopped doing it because it's always the same. The average was about 2%. So that means about over 95%, just to be conservative about the findings, have never been told what it is they're doing. Because if you don't define the mind, you can't define a healthy mind if you don't say what the mind is. So this is just an interesting issue about our past. So that's number one. Number two, we do have the word mind, which since the time of Hippocrates 2,500 years ago, for our history, Bessel and I are both physicians, in medicine, the mind, all your joys and sorrows, were attributed to the brain. Right? And that's what we're taught in medical school. And in fact, William James, a physician who was the father of modern psychology, he said the same thing. He just reaffirmed what Hippocrates said thousands of years before. It's obvious. The mind is just brain activity, basically. Now, if you say that, what I'm going to suggest to you is you lose the heart of what we do in psychotherapy. But when I was a training director not so long ago in the 90s in child psychiatry, one of the heads who was looking to be the head of all training directors, he was the head of the Harvard programs, and he comes, Joe Coyle, and he said, the future of psychiatry is to be a cognitive neurologist identifying the brain disorders that lead to problems with thinking. Right? So this issue of just making mind equivalent to brain, mind is what brain does, is actually a common statement in academia. And, bless you, in fact, let's have a bless you for everyone who's going to sneeze. Ready? Bless you. It's a common statement, but what I'm going to suggest to you is we need to expand our view, perhaps, and at least come with a definition of the mind. So that's number two. We have this loss of community. We have number two, we don't define what mental is. Number three, we actually don't define what, therefore, mental health is. So this is a bit of a problem just in terms of our history, right? Then in terms of, the last 100 years, we have this siloed view that happens in a lot of fields, where you get people who do psychoanalysis or doing one thing, people who do cognitive therapy do another, behavior therapy, and we have people who have strong convictions, like me, for example, or Bessel, or somebody, and you have to be very careful of your strong convictions, because what was the strong conviction about what the cause of autism was? What was that? The mother was like a refrigerator, right? And there was so much conviction, right, about it. And it was completely wrong. And so many parents were put through hell, basically, because they were accused of causing this serious problem with their kid. What was schizophrenia said to be caused by in the 50s and 60s? Double bind, right? Not true. Right? Not true. So we have a history in the last 100 years of coming up with narratives. We are a narrative creature in addition to being a social creature. And interestingly, the narrative circuitry of the brain and the social circuitry overlap with the circuitry of consciousness. So we can talk about that more. But the fascinating thing about that is you want to grab some sense of certainty by having a story that makes you convinced of its accuracy, what's called its veracity or veridicality. So the cohesiveness of the story is mistaken for its being true. Right? And then you get someone who likes to come up here on a stage and say, autism is caused by refrigerator mothers, you got to unrefrigerate those mothers and all this kind of stuff. People say, okay, well that makes sense. How else would autism be caused? And those guys up there, are so convinced it must be true, because I'm not sure, but they're sure. So we gravitate, as you can see in politics, to people who stand up with some kind of story that, at least makes you, in all the uncertainty of the world, say, I'll go with that guy. And it's usually guys, of course, so that's why I'm saying guy. So to be open to uncertainty is something we're going to talk about. So this is the next point, which is that we've come up with causality which has been profoundly wrong. And part of what happened, I think, to build on what Bessel is beautifully describing, is, at least in my field, I'm a child psychiatrist, we were banished from ever looking to parent experiences, number one, or even experiences in general. In the late 70s, when I was in medical school, in early 80s, when I went to pediatrics, and then psychiatry and then child psychiatry, you were not supposed to talk about anything like double binds or refrigerator mothers, because we knew it was wrong, and there was a biological model that was a pseudo foundation for what our field, psychiatry, created was the DSM in 1980. When I was a medical student in 78, they were testing the DSM-3 on us and saying, we want a clinician in Iowa to be able to talk to a clinician in Idaho, to talk to a clinician in India. When you use the word depression, we want to have this, menu of things that meet the criteria for depression. It made sense, actually. What we didn't realize since 1980 was that people would mistake the map for the territory. And this was a sad, sad thing. And so everyone around the planet, yeah, of course.
Footnote. Because I was part of the DSM-3 and 4, in the preamble of the DSM-3, we needed to put it into to do drug research, because very lots of promise in various drugs. So we had to make diagnosis to see what symptoms would disappear. So we made this list of symptoms. Not diagnosis, a list of symptoms. We called research diagnostic criteria that morphed into the so-called diagnosis. In the preamble of the DSM-3 it says, this is just a list of symptoms. This should never be used, this is not an accurate scientific definition, this should never be used for forensic or insurance purposes. That sentence disappears from the DSM-4.
So let's all wind the clocks back to this time. I was a student, Bessel was on the committee. We're talking 1978, 79, and then it's published in 1980, right? In part, the intention was pure, in part, okay? Let's just own it. But there's something in the way information processing happens in the mind that includes aspects of the brain and our relationships, called top-down processing, where when you get what's called a model, and this is a formal cognitive science term, a mental model, you basically, what a model does is it takes incoming sensory streams, like what a client or patient may say, filters it through the model, okay? And what it does is it makes sensation turn into perception, okay? So there is no such thing as immaculate perception. I mean, it's funny, but it's also really true and really serious. Because once you're taught in school about the DSM-3 and you forget what the forward used to say, I don't think it says it anymore. Yeah, but what it used to say, then what you do is you go, there's depression. Or like when I was in medical school, my other medical students in the locker room would say, I saw an incredible liver today. And I would go, don't you mean you saw a person with a liver disease? And they go, oh, you're from California, aren't you? But you saw it go so fast because they were so busy, they had to experience through their model, this was a liver, I have to make sure to see a pancreas, and then I want to see a stomach, and I've got to see the great intestine and the small intestine, and literally consciousness is shaped by these top-down mental models. Okay, so it's not just, it's, what I was taught, and I'll have a wide open view. No, once your model grabs sensation and filters it and twists it into perception, you are literally perceiving things that you're conceiving of by the books you read and what your teachers told you. This is a very serious just aspect of being human, yeah? So we don't want to beat ourselves up, but we want to liberate ourselves from the prison of these mental models. Well, you can open up the models. Let's put it that way. We want to adopt new mental models. You're right.
Model people.
You're absolutely true. Bessel's absolutely right. He said you can't liberate yourself. What I want to say is the mental models we have are too imprisoning. You can create a new way of doing it. So in this point, I'm trying to make about the past. The DSM has been mistaken for reality. And so our clients, our patients, through the filter of insurance requirements and even what are these things called? These evidence-based approaches that deal with this disorder and that disorder.
I blocked on that one.
I got blocked on that. So that has shaped it not being about relationships. But if you look at the work by John Norcross that does these meta-analyses of psychotherapy, no matter what your approach is, it really comes down to this deep way of a connection with our clients. So the final thing I just want to say about this is when Bessel and when you and I first met, probably at a dissociation meeting, one of my first patients had dissociation, had multiple personality disorder, dissociative identity disorder, so I got introduced to Bessel and to Frank Putnam and all sorts of other folks through my teachers very, very early on in the 80s. And we went through this long line of difficulties because the field wasn't as rigorous perhaps as it could be, and then there was the backlash where people were saying anyone who talks about an adult remembering childhood trauma is having false memories, and so people were being sued and losing their licenses, and in fact therapists were being a little bit cavalier, saying to their clients, if you don't remember something, then something bad must have happened, which is completely wrong. If you just look at just regular aspects of memory, there's normal childhood amnesia before the age of of around 5 to 7. So, therapists really went to town on this idea. So we want to be really careful and conservative and grounded in science. What happened with me, just to put this final point on, in 1990, I was a research fellow studying attachment with Mary Main, and it was the beginning of the decade of the brain. Pharmaceutical industries were having a heyday building on the DSM, and insurance companies. So that in psychiatry, that was our book, the DSM, we could say outrageous things like, if you don't meet a diagnostic criteria for a disorder, we're not going to pay for your stay in a hospital. That's one wild thing. So you had to get a DSM diagnosis. The second thing is, if you're in a hospital, you better be on a medication, because everyone knows that mental disorders are basically brain problems, and if you have a brain problem and we're paying for you to be in a hospital, you better be on a drug, right? So then people had to be prescribed medications. And just a parenthetic comment, as you probably know, if you're a researcher doing studies and you get negative results, that is, they didn't show what you tried to show, you just don't publish them. Right? So the only thing...
You can't get them published either.
And you can't get them published. So in fact, when you look at the literature, maybe you think for certain disorders like moderate depression, these